what's important to remember is like advanced machine learning is often something that just makes something that already exists a little bit better. It's not something that like enables you to do that thing in the first place. And so, I do think that the music recommendations at Spotify makes Spotify, X% better, but it's not the like thing in itself that is the magic of Spotify, I think. It's the sort of thing you built on top of it that makes it extra magic.
Welcome to The Right Track, a podcast for people building data cultures. We will hear from leaders in engineering, product, and data as they share their frustrating and inspiring stories on building the best products for their customers by mastering outcome-driven development, self-serve analytics, and great data cultures. I am Stefania Ólafsdóttir, CEO and co-founder of Avo, the analytics governance platform, changing how developers, product managers, and data scientists collaborate to plan, track, and govern their product analytics. Keep the conversation going with us in the Right Track community. Join us on therighttrack.avo.app. In this episode, I spoke with Erik Bernhardsson. Erik was early at Spotify and built out their data team. He originally joined to work on music recommendations, but ended up prioritizing more important things. Eventually, he did get to build the core recommendation system, making all of our lives better. And along the way, they built Luigi, which is one of the first major open source workflow schedulers. And we also used that at QuizUp. He later joined a company called Better as their CTO and employee number 8, and built a tech team of eventually 300 people, including the data team. Now he is working on something new, and I think it's safe to say that we're all pretty excited for that reveal. Spotify's org structure was an inspiration for how we structured our teams at QuizUp, and including how we thought about the data team. So it's a great pleasure to have Erik on the right track to talk about his experience building data cultures. We covered a lot of ground, including the mind-blowing experience when you first try cohort analysis and find something unexpected. We also talked about how advanced machine learning should typically wait until you've fixed your data fundamentals, the data plumbing. And we talked about how and when you should prioritize that data plumbing that you can't ignore, including consistent event logging. We also discussed data team recruiting and org structures, and how hiring the right people to your early stage data team is the most important factor for success. And for Erik, that means something like a technical data journalist, meaning people who, sure, they're good with numbers, they're okay with stats, they're okay in software engineering, but above all, they are driven by a pursuit of the truth and making an impact on the business. Listen in for Erik's thoughts on strategy when building and scaling a data team and data culture, and sit back and enjoy when he convinces you that simple things are usually far more impactful than complicated things. Hello, Erik, and welcome to The Right Track.
Thank you.
To give us all context, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you got there?
Do you want the long story or the short story?
I would love the long 5-hour story, but maybe we can find some okay. Medium in between.
I'll try to condense it. I'm Erik Bernhardsson. I'm currently working on some random projects in data, but sort of to give it, a little bit longer context of how I ended up here. I'm from Sweden. I was doing a lot of programming competitions when I was young, and then when I was deciding to think about what to do after school, like a lot of my friends at that time from school doing these programming competitions started at this obscure music streaming company called Spotify. And I decided, like, I don't know what's going on, but like clearly they're hiring all these like smart people. So I want to go work with them and see what, and hopefully I'll enjoy it, because there was a bunch of people that I really looked up to and really respected. So I was able to convince Spotify to hire me to do music recommendations, which kind of was a little bit of a joke, because like I didn't even know anything about machine learning at that time. But I think early on at Spotify, like no one really knew anything, and it was a good place to be, because like, the fact that like, I didn't know anything still meant like I was like the best person to do it in a certain way, like the least bad person. So I joined Spotify and started hacking on that, and then relatively quickly realized that there was far more important things to do than focusing on music recommendations. So I actually stopped doing that for a while, and instead I spent about a year and a half building up a data team. So we did a lot of sort of business and intelligence type stuff, working with a lot of different stakeholders across the business and fundraising and investors and also just product analytics. I left briefly, went to a hedge fund, and then actually came back to Spotify, but in New York, where I ended up spending another 3.5 years focusing this time on music recommendations. So I ended up building out and launching a number of features with music recommendations, built up a team of about 20 engineers. Open source thing called Luigi, which is one of the first major open source workflow schedulers.
Which we used at QuizUp. Thank you.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people used it back then. I think now, like these days, like Airflow and other ones have taken over. But so did that open source another thing called like Annoy. That's a lot of people used. But then I ended up leaving Spotify in 2015. I felt like I kind of wanted to go through the same journey again. I sort of missed the early days of Spotify and ended up joining a very early stage company as a CTO. And the company was called Better. I was number 8 or something like that. And I spent 6 years there building up a tech team of about 300 people. In the end, I sort of realized like I keep postponing the things I always wanted to do, which is to start my own company. And so I parted ways with Better on good terms and, helped them find a new CTO and all that stuff. And then, since earlier this year, I've been starting to play around with different data things and starting to look at the space and trying to figure out, okay, what are the opportunities? Like, what should I be working on? And I just started like doing a little bit more seriously. I finally have an office and I started to hire people and we have some prototypes we're working on, but it's still pretty early stage.
Very exciting. Would you say stealth mode?
I would say stealth mode, but I don't really like that term because I feel like some companies like kind of try to create like a weird sort of hype out of being in stealth. At least like I felt like that a few years ago. To me, it's sort of just necessary evil. Like we just haven't found like a good pitch, and we're also building something that's like kind of complex, and it's going to take a long time working with various types of closed stage, closed beta design partners to really figure out like how's it going to work.
Very exciting. I look forward to part 2 of this conversation later when we can all learn a little bit more about this.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
I think everyone is dying to know what Erik does next.
I kind of want it to be something no one expects, like Uber for dog walking, because like everyone's like, what is he working on? Like,
exactly. Well, thank you so much for that intro, Erik. I hope this sheds a light for everyone listening on how excited I am to be having this conversation, because there's a lot to dig in there, obviously. And you have a great experience and you've been in the space for a really long time and you've shaped a lot of discussions and you've also built huge teams. And so I'm excited to dive deeper into that backstory. Before we do, would you mind kicking us off with some real-life traumatizing data stories? Maybe some inspiring ones as well, but, something frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so much of like frustration has really been like on the people side. Like I'm the kind of person, like if, something on the technical side breaks, like it's actually in a way like less stressful. I don't know, like there's been so many cases where, we've done the wrong things or kind of in retrospect, like messed things up. And I mean, I like some of the things comes to mind, like, in the company I worked at, like we used the wrong metrics to optimize something, for ad, like basically like, when you're spending like millions and millions of dollars of ads and you're like optimizing for like, account signups, but then you realize actually like, transaction volume is like completely backwards. Like there's a lot of users who create accounts, but never actually, do anything. And so, yeah, like, we discovered at some point, like there's this like almost like inverse correlation between like, cost per accounts and like the ROI. And so that was like one example where like in looking back, like we should have like built out those data pipelines like much earlier. We probably wasted like $10 million, like, just throwing like ad dollars on like completely broken channels because we didn't realize it. So I don't know. I have a lot of stories like that where I think, in retrospect, like, if we just like thought a little bit smarter about like how we think about data, how we measure things and what are the main metrics, like clearly we wouldn't have done all these. And like, I think, a lot of companies go through this. It's probably a pretty normal story.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. At least like when you're at the stage of spending millions of dollars on ads. And then like, I guess a really calling follow-up question for me here is, how did you then finally discover that you could probably be using a different metric? What was the trigger and what was your learning process for that?
It was just like a lot of plumbing. I mean, it was like very early. And so a lot of the like reason we hadn't done it was just like the data didn't quite exist. Like there's just like a lot of plumbing we had to do first. And so I think, I don't know if there's like a general learning experience here, but like, I think, I've almost every time when I've like sold these like plumbing things, I wish I would have just sold them like a year earlier. So I think, and I'm a very data-driven person. I'm like, we should like get all the data into the data warehouse as early as possible. But even for me, I'm like regretting all these times when I didn't do that. So to me, that's, maybe goes a long way to say like maybe, already when you're like building the features and like starting and just getting off the ground, like is a good time to start thinking about tracking and logging and like how you store events and all that stuff. Because you're going to realize very soon that it's actually very useful to have that data.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point. It's a really interesting problem, though. And it's like that scale-up period when you're scaling up an organization. It's just like over-engineering. It's like such a delicate balance of investing in something that is future-proof or helps you in the future. And you know that future self will thank you for it. But what are you going to sacrifice instead, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, it's super hard. Because like if you read like Twitter, like there's like 500 million like thought leaders like saying it's like, oh, when you're like 10 people, that's the time to invest in like a chief happiness officer. And you like what and if you follow like every single advice like that, like when are you actually going to build your startup?
Exactly.
Like, and so like I think, to me the most important thing is like, to learn which one of those like you can ignore. Like because like 99% of that advice is like probably wrong. Because like if you follow all of those advice, like you're never going to actually do the work.
Exactly.
But some of the things are actually very important to do. And so I don't know, like I don't want to make like any sweeping generalizations, but I find that that's like something that's like so hard to do. It's like, defer everything about except the like absolutely necessary. But what are the things that are absolutely necessary right now? Like I don't know, like it's hard, right?
Yeah, and this is something that I guess probably like, this is the thing that experience gives you.
Yeah, I hope so.
Exactly. But like, I mean, on that note, I mean, what is the right time to do it? I mean, because it sounds like you've gone through a bunch of periods where like, I wish I had invested in that a year ago. And you mentioned like logging events consistently or start to think about like your plumbing, as you call them. What is realistically the time that you should have done it, for example?
I think the best answer like on the spot would be like, I think it's so dependent on like to what extent like data drives your like revenue and your costs. For a lot of types of companies, like if you're a B2B SaaS company, like it's actually very hard to like A/B test or even know anything about. Like, so it's maybe in that case, like it doesn't matter, right? But if you're like doing, consumer stuff where you have a lot of, scale at what you're doing, if you're spending, millions and millions of ad dollars, like my guess is like there's probably a set of factors like that determine like, yeah, in that case, like you better like really work on your data stack because that has such massive impact on the bottom line.
Yeah. That's a good on the spot answer to a very difficult question.
Thank you.
And I'll probably want to touch on that a little bit later on, like your experience with building a data team and when you should hire the right folks for that and where they fall into the organization and things like that. But thank you for sharing that frustrating story. Can you inspire us as well? A little bit.
Basically, like one of the first things I did at Spotify, and this was like I was like straight out of school, was like early on at Spotify, like there was always this like debate, like is the freemium model gonna work? Mm-hmm. Like we have all these like ad funded users, and we weren't really getting that much money from the ads, and then we're like kind of praying that they would convert to premium and we'd like make money back from them, and there was always like this argument like very few people actually use premium, so like does it actually make any sense? And so I remember this was like one of the first things I ever did, like in my career, like working on data, was like just like, let's look at a cohort plot. And I didn't know the name back then. Like I was just like, okay, I'm just going to plot like the percentage of users that convert to premium. But like, I'm going to pick like a cohort of people that like joined a certain month and I'm just going to track them over time. And then you saw this like beautiful, like, linear curve where like every month, like these people, just the premium conversion just kept going up and up. And I mean, this was like at the time, like Spotify was raising, I think their B round or whatever. And this went straight into the board deck. It was like a big part of like investor presentations. And I like to think, it did make a huge difference at that time. I mean, I don't know, but like I think, to me, like that was like one of the first like sort of gratifying like things I've done, in the sense like I felt like actually like what I do has some sort of meaningful impact, and I got hooked. I'm like, because I up until then I considered me to be this like very like algo driven, like I like to solve technical problems type of person. But I think that was like the first time I realized like actually this is kind of cool. Like I found something in data that has like a meaningful impact on building a company. And so that, and then I just kept going after that. Like, like how can I find more things? Like how can I like discover insights? And, it's fun.
That's a really beautiful story. That's exactly, you're the hero we didn't deserve, but the hero we needed by bringing us that story. But I totally relate to the cohort thing. I remember, like, I mean, and I guess that touches a little bit on, like, I remember thinking when you were delivering the intro, it's interesting to think of people's different paths into going into data. And so in your case, it sounds like you went from the sort of developer world into becoming a data specialist, data scientist, data whatever data we want to call it. Data has something, data person. And so obviously we don't have all of the, the words and the vocabularies. And I remember an exact same experience with like, what cohort analysis? What? Even though you've heard about cohorts before, but you sort of probably just never put it in context with like product analytics or like user experience analytics or things like that. I don't know.
Cohort analytics has been a consistent theme throughout my life, where like I've like plotted something as a cohort and like blown someone's mind. They're like, wait a minute, you can look at it that way? Like, and I still feel like, now it's like, a lot of people do it, but still like, I feel like there's like, sometimes like people really, they're like, wait a minute, that's like pretty cool.
Yeah.
I feel like, and survival analysis, which is sort of a related type of analysis. Like, I think it's such an underappreciated aspect of like data analytics these days. Yeah. It's not even like rocket science. It's like pretty straightforward, like just, sorting events by time and like kind of grouping it and,
Exactly. It's really powerful. For whoever's listening, can you tell us what survival analysis is, since you mentioned it?
Yeah, survival analysis is like, as the name implies, it's about like the sort of inevitability of death, and like, like comes from like sort of medical research and like looking at like, if you, I don't know, like maybe this is like me making up a story, but like if you administer a drug, like then like looking at, okay, like what percentage of people survive, and like maybe you look at a control group and a test group, and, the problem is like some of these people like have not died yet. So what can we infer, right? Like, if they haven't died for a really long time, like maybe that's a good thing. So in like tech businesses, I tend to think it's like the other way around. It's not like deaths, it's like conversions instead. So you kind of flip it upside down, and instead you look at like, conversions after a certain time. And what ends up being always like challenging with these types of analysis is like, you often end up like forcing the sort of crude way to analyze a lot of these things is like, you have some sort of complicated model, you're trying to understand like who converts and who doesn't convert, and like what is the outcome variable you're trying to track, and it's kind of like both like conversion, but it's also time to conversion. And a very crude way would be to like, okay, actually we're going to look at conversion rate at like 30 days out. But if you're doing that, you're kind of throwing away a lot of information, because you might actually have people like convert like earlier, or people who haven't converted at all after 29 days or whatever. And like you're kind of throwing out a lot of that ability to like learn quicker, which is called like censoring in survival analysis. You have this like left censoring and right censoring, this idea that like you've only observed a certain person up to a certain point, but they might still convert in the future. You don't know. And so survival analysis lets you deal with this in kind of a nice, consistent way, where you can build like cohort curves and incorporating the sensor data, the data from people who haven't maybe converted yet, but maybe will convert in the future, and look at, two different cohorts and say something much, much quicker than you would otherwise would have said, earlier than 30 days or whatever. And then there's all this like science you can get into, like more complicated models. There's like starting with Kaplan-Meier, but then, there's like Cox proportional hazard, and you can start to fit like, I spent a lot of time like building like a thing that fit like Weibull distribution, because it turned out that actually, very beautifully approximated like the commercial curves. And that actually ended up like saving, like improving like our ad performance by like, in a way that like saved us millions and millions of dollars every month. And so, these things can have a very large impact if you do it right.
Exactly. And I think, when you're bringing this up and your magic moment around your first cohort analysis, I think the birth of these for each individual is probably when you just think of segmenting by a specific dimension. You're like, interesting. What if I filter out these people, or what if I filter out by that?
Yeah.
And then you reach the stage of you start to develop like a skill or take time to do survival analysis because you've learned some things about like how that works and how you can treat different cohorts in a different manner. How can we help people reach this discovery sooner?
I don't know. I've tried to blog a few times, so I have some blog posts on the topic. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, I think there's probably better tools could be needed. Like, I think there's probably an opportunity to build like sort of, a cohort analysis tool that could be, its own startup. Through more sort of blogging and teaching and knowledge sharing, hopefully, these things permeate through as tools.
The all-encompassing data community of the internet.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Maybe a quick follow-up question on this. Like, what was your role when you did this? Like, what were you working on when you stumbled upon doing this?
I mean, I kind of mixed up like a lot of different experiences. Like, it started, like, as I said, there's been my whole career. Like, so part of it was like doing it at Spotify in the early days. Like, later it was like, me as a CTO, just like, looking at data at Better. I have a math background, so like, I started realizing, you can use viable distributions for these things. So it's been something that's recurring throughout my entire career, like different roles.
Yeah, exactly. And you already mentioned it a little bit, like when you joined Spotify, you thought you wanted to work on, or you would work on the recommendation algorithm that first time around, but then you had more pressing issues. And then you started building a data team, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's like looking back then, like Spotify's like main breakthrough and like the main utility people use it for is like, you want to click play on a track in the cloud, and then it like, you get the music, and, and that is the like magic moment of Spotify. And so, like what we sort of realized, like Spotify had like more urgent issues, making that work, and, also just like raising money, and, because money is the sort of oxygen of any startup. And so I think it made sense to not do recommendations for a while. And I think what's important to remember is like advanced machine learning is often something that just makes something that already exists a little bit better. It's not something that like enables you to do that thing in the first place. And so, I'm very happy in the end. Like I do think that the music recommendations at Spotify makes Spotify, X% better. But, it's not the like thing in itself that is the magic of Spotify, I think. It's the sort of thing you built on top of it that makes it extra magic.
Discover weekly. Oh my God.
That's right. Yeah.
That's very good stuff. And when you realized that, was there a data team at place at Spotify? Or were you the person that went like, I think...
No. I built it up. I proposed it, and initially like there was a push to build a team focused on reporting, and like my argument was like, why don't we broaden the mandate and make it about sort of product analytics and business intelligence and all kinds of stuff. And so I started managing that team. I was pretty young, like 25 or something like that, and it wasn't a particularly big team. I think we were like 4 people in the team in the end when I moved to New York. But I mean, now it's like I think 200-300 people probably at Spotify or something like that, probably even more. So it was fun. Like, and this was back in the days, like no one was really doing data. Like there wasn't any like, patterns. There wasn't really like best practices. We kind of just like did whatever we needed to. And it was like, the tools were terrible. It was all like Hadoop and like awful things, like running like even basic queries, like took, hours. But I guess, we did what we could with the tools we had. And I'm glad to see that like these days, it's not quite as bad.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's a really good point. I relate heavily to this. I know we talked about it a little bit earlier. There's a lot of people, everyone in their own corner, slightly inventing the wheel a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish they didn't. I mean, it would be nice if someone could just do it for them, right?
Yeah. And we're approaching that. I mean, everyone is knowledge sharing so heavily about this right now. And this is maybe a good segue into, how do you see that the industry has changed? I like to think about it from like even just like a small period of like 2 years, because we are moving super rapidly, but also from this perspective of like, you now have like 13 years going on right now. Yeah.
I've been coding for almost 30 years, but 13, 14 years, something like that, working as an engineer. Yeah, and like in the data world, like of course many things. I mean, when I started working, like the cloud didn't exist or anything like that, and data warehouses were like the only one that existed was Oracle, and like if you wanted to do anything as a startup, like most people did Hadoop, and it was terrible. I think like we've come a long way. Like it's so much easier to work with data. I think, I mean, particularly like zooming in the last 2 years, like I guess like the big transformation has been like probably like the sort of Snowflake DBT combo feels like it's like so dominant these days. And I think, to me, it's like almost like, in hindsight, maybe like an obvious thing, like, why didn't we get that sooner? And maybe part of it was like, we didn't quite have SQL as a data warehouse out this way. But like, to me, that's been the sort of most interesting transformation in the last 2 years, like the sort of wildfire spread of DBT and like how clearly it solves a problem that a lot of people had, right?
I wonder how big also a part of that growth has been their strategy of really focusing on the community.
I think it's huge. And I think, I mean, in general, I feel like it's less about the community, but like more like, I feel like it's like almost like creating a narrative of like sort of a dominant platform and like, a sort of a movement. And like I almost like feel that way when I look at like the sort of positioning of DBT as like it's a tool for data or for analytics engineer. Like they almost like created as like roll out of nowhere. Like I think there was a lot of people throughout many companies sort of they weren't really sure like who am I, like what am I working on, and then DBT is like you're an analytics engineer. Like this is how you do it, and like there's like a certain movement aspect to it where like now like all these people are like yeah I'm an analytics engineer, and like and then all the other companies now like latching onto that and like yeah this is like the new data stack, like we're part of it too, and like and like you get this like sort of interesting sort of follow on effect where like everyone's like trying to cruise on that like that trend, right? So I don't know where it's going to end, like where we're going, but I think it's been really interesting to observe.
Yeah, that's a really good positioning of it. It's a sense of belonging almost. If we look at like the Maslow pyramid of needs, it's like, the first thing is like, don't die. And like, violence in your life is the second layer. The first layer is like, have enough food so you don't die. The third one is a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
So,
and then I think the highest one is like self-actualization, right? Or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Exactly. So they're sort of building us on the journey of that.
Yeah.
So that's a great identification. I would love to maybe move a little bit into sort of data cultures now. This is a good segue into that. Like, what are the roles in companies and sort of how people build their teams and things like that? You also talked about like when we were talking about how analytics are broken, you mentioned that sort of like also is a people problem.
Yeah.
I'll just, open with this. I don't trust this data. It's such a common statement. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on like, why is that and how can people solve that?
I kind of like it. Like, because in a way, it's like, I'd rather have like, it's like the scientific discourse. Like the whole point is like, someone proposes like a thesis and then other people go and scrutinize it. Is that right? Is that not right? Like, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing where if like people don't trust the data and my, I'd rather have like too many people making too many conclusions about data that may be wrong than like too few people even looking at data. Yeah. So I'm sort of, pro like having like a constructive disagreement and arguments and trying to this, and when I've seen that really work is like when you have that sort of mutual respect and admiration and like this platform of trust of people, then, if those people argue about something, then it's like, you're not like trying to like put down a person, you're trying to like together find the truth. And that's like actually a good thing. Like you're like arguing about like, I don't trust what you're saying, but like, I'm arguing because I want to figure out, I'm also interested, what is the truth here? And that like, I think, that's the sort of, to me, like the aspiration that everyone should try to get to, right?
Yeah, I love that perspective. That's a fresh perspective. So when people say, I don't trust this data, that's a good thing.
Yeah. But to answer your question, like, why is that? I don't know. Like, I've seen so many mistakes, like people sort of, take like correlational things and like present it as if it's like, causal and like, or like making assumptions, like you rolled out a feature. Okay. Like look at it like pre-post, like here's, like there's a lot of just like kind of sloppy analytics that I think is being done. And I think, I've actually seen a lot more of that than like, technical issues. Like, sometimes, of course, you have like technical data gathering problems. But more so, I've seen, issues where people make sort of implications of data, like from purely correlational or like other sort of, sloppy kind of, conclusions.
Interesting. So you're saying when people don't trust the data, it's more often when someone is actually trying to make a statement about some truth rather than when like they are literally just trying to dig into the data and the data is broken.
Yeah, I mean, like the times when like I've had these like good arguments about data, it's like when someone finds like a really strong relationship, and then like the argument is like, is this actually like causal, or is this just like some random like weird thing that you can explain because there's some confounding thing? I mean, this is like one example, but like, so it's a starting point, but I think I think it's good to be a little skeptical when you see like, a very impressive result somewhere.
Yes, and like to take it a step back, I think typically when I see very impressive results or very terrible results, my first assumption is like, there's something wrong with the data behind this.
Yeah, you should.
Exactly.
Yeah, you should doubt it.
Yeah, because it's very difficult to get your data right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So maybe moving that into also like who is then working with the data? You've now touched on like the org structures a little bit at Spotify, and that's a famous example, obviously, the org structures at Spotify. And then, of course, at Better, I'm curious to hear how you scaled up the team at Better and how the data team was involved there and what the org structure was. Can you maybe just share a little bit those two examples? Like, what was the org structure data-wise? How did data work with product and engineering in those two companies? Were they integrated with the product teams or were they separate teams and things like that?
No, I mean, first of all, Spotify. I left Spotify 6 years ago, so I think this is somewhat dated. But like at that time, it was this fully centralized data team, and I think that was in retrospect bad because everyone had to come to me and ask for help, and like I made this sort of discretionary decisions, and and like who am I going to help or not? And I think that in retrospect, I think people like didn't feel like they got the support they needed, and so I think that created a lot of unnecessary pain. I wish would have spent a lot more time like sort of building up, more like here's your backlog and, here's your resources and here's some self-service tools. I think I did a better job at Better doing that. What I ended up with is instead like I ended up still having centralized data teams, but tried as much as possible to decentralize the backlog management. So I had sort of embedded data scientists or data engineers like working together with other teams, like in particular product managers, but also in many other cases, even, teams like finance or whatever. Marketing, a good example too, where they would be their like main sort of point of contact in terms of like what I'm actually working on, whereas like you still have the sort of mothership that sort of helped supervise like are we doing analysis in the right ways, and are we contributing back to the data platform in the right way, and but like day-to-day like work was like more like your identity is more like no, like you're working with the marketing team, that's like your goal is to like help marketing or whatever. But you're a data engineer or data scientist, and don't forget that.
Yeah.
And I think that's like as good as it gets. Like I'm sort of, never love like hybrid approaches, but I do think for data, it is a weird case where like clearly there is like a set of like very specialized knowledge you need in order to be good at data. But also, to some extent, like that skill is being needed by, a very completely different type of team.
Yeah, exactly. And so this, having a centralized team, but also embedded, the hybrid model, it empowers both the professional growth of the data folks, but also empowers and makes sure that the communication paths are super strong and that each team is empowered to make good data decisions. And even furthermore, like the fact that you specialize in finance or marketing or something, it just makes you a better ally for that team.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and I think it's worth to be aware of the drawbacks, right? Like it is very hard as a manager to know what your direct reports are doing if they're spread out over like 10 teams. And that's something I saw at Spotify too, like in this matrix model. Like it's very hard to have like good accountability and also good recognition of good work. And so managers do need to spend an even more time like thinking about like how am I making myself available? How am I keeping my direct reports accountable? And how am I like recognizing the good work? Like it's very hard as a manager when you have this sort of embedding model.
So that's a good input. And I want to ask a follow-up question of that. So it sounds like, and I assume you're talking about Better here, they did report to, like ultimately they reported to the CTO, and was there like a data person, a data leader also that reported to you that they reported directly to or something like that?
in the end, there was a data leader in between me. Like I managed the data team directly for quite some time, given that I had a lot of background in data, and the team was quite small for a long time. But then in the end, like, in my last year or so, we had data leaders.
So is it right then that you were managing a bunch of different product teams as the CTO, a set of engineering teams basically did they also have product managers and things like that reporting to you, or did they report to
No, they reported into the product. They had a product.
Okay. And so the data people on the teams, they were embedded in those teams, but reported directly to you.
Correct.
And even when you hired a data leader in between, those teams would report to you, or some sort of an engineering leader maybe that reported to you, but the data folks would still report to the data leader.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, I strongly think that data teams should be a part of tech. I mean, what they're building is, writing code. And, in the last few years, it's shifted away a little bit from like, less code and more like, less like Python and more SQL. But it's still like, to me, it's like, it's production pipelines. It's, it's version control. It's like, pull requests. It's code to me. And it's the same sort of engineering mindset. And I think it sets them up for success to report into tech.
That is a really great observation, and it sparks two follow-up questions from me. First one is sort of tapping into what I was mentioning from your intro. You entered data as a developer, like you were a developer by training, had been doing a lot of software engineering, things like that. How did you build your data team? Did you recruit from that angle? Did you recruit someone who had maybe like a different type of experience? What are the roles, backgrounds?
Yeah. Actually, my background is a little bit weird. I studied physics, but I grew up like coding all the time. So like I have a little bit of weird background. I think, but like physics actually did help me a lot, like going into data, because I obviously know a little bit more about math than someone from with a computer science background. But yeah, like I think, in terms of building up the team, like my feeling, I mean, this goes for like any team, right? Like, engineer, like software engineers or data team, like you want like early on, like you need full stack people as much as possible, because you don't know what you're going to need from day to day. And you're going to need people who are like flexible, can jump around as much as possible. So I very intentionally, in the earliest days of building up a data team, I was very intentionally put the role description as data engineer. Because my feeling was like, if I hire a data engineer who's also like kind of like entrepreneurial and cares about the business, like they can sort of like build a platform while doing the analytics, and like let the analytics work kind of inform the platform they're building. And they can be this like full stack person who can like jump around. Like they can take, today I'm going to look at this thing. And oh, by the way, actually, in order to do that, I need to ingest this new data set and like index it and like blah, 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 and like build a pipeline and then go back and do the analytics. And so I did that for almost 2 years, like where I had a combined team doing both data engineering and data science. And I called everyone data engineer, even though like they're probably more like data science, like in like what they did day to day. But data science these days has been such an overloaded term, like that I found that in a way it was like a little bit easier. Like if you want to hire a full stack data scientist, it's actually easier to put data engineer on the role description and just look at the people that apply for the role. And I mean, of course, we did a lot of sourcing as well.
Yeah, but you're touching on a really interesting subject there, which is like sort of, I feel like there's a lot of discussion lately about like bringing in people that have soft skills and then they can learn the hard skills. But you talked also about like, okay, you put data engineering in the role description and then you filtered sort of and recruited for also like entrepreneurial mindsets and things like that. How do you find those people? How do you filter for those people?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like somewhat controversial opinion maybe, but like I think soft skills are in abundance and like hard skills are scarce. And so like I think it's much better to hire for hard skills and then filter out on like those people having sort of a base level of soft skills than, teaching people hard skills, which can be extremely hard. Especially if it takes a lot of experience, like learning about like how to work with data or like learning, statistics or machine learning, like whatever, that's hard. So I always wanted to hire people who are like the best people early stage in a tech team, in a data team, I think are people who they understand data, like they're like okay at like the numbers. They understand like software engineering. They don't have to be like the world's best like distributed system, like database, like whatever, but like they're like decent at like, they know how to use Git or whatever, like, But most importantly, they're excited about like the business. They're like excited about like the outcome and like how my analysis is like driving business outcomes and like kind of like, they want to find the truth in the data. They're like data journalists. They're like, what's lurking in the data? Like, what can we find today that's going to have a huge impact? And there's no like, easy way to filter for that. But like, I mean, I think, there's a lot of ways to filter out people on the other side of the spectrum. Sometimes you start talking to people and they're like, like I think there's like a spectrum of like goal-oriented people versus like tool-oriented people. And it's like pretty easy to like determine that someone is like tool-oriented. If they're really like super obsessed about like functional programming, like, maybe they're really smart, and that's fine. But like, I think there's always going to be a conflict of interest if, today the type of work we need as a business to be successful doesn't have anything to do with functional programming. That might be a problem. We might have conflicts of interest here. So like, for those reasons, like, I think it's very dangerous to hire these like tool-oriented people. Same goes for something like machine learning. If you make your career pursuit to, improve your knowledge in machine learning, that's fine. Like, there's a lot of like large established companies where they need people like that. At a startup, that might be like very, very dangerous to hire a person like that, because they might think, everything needs machine learning. That's not true. Like 10% of things need machine learning. So what I want to hire is like the people who like, maybe they know machine learning, but for them, it's just a tool in the toolbox. And the real goal is to, figure out what the business need and build those things. And if that involves like going through an Excel file and like, manually classifying, text message, like whatever it is, like, and they have to do that for 3 days. Like, if it drives like a really important business outcome, like, they're happy to do that. And so, I like to kind of go deeper and like ask people like, how do you feel about working on like, boring things, unsexy things? Like, what's like a good story of something you found in data that was like surprising, and how did you find it? And I like trying to go deeper into like, what is motivating this person?
Mm-hmm. I love that identification. I also want to say, just data journalists, I relate so heavily to it. It's a person that is extremely curious to learn some new things and sort of find some value. And I think what you just said, are you okay with working on boring things? It's sort of like a filter for like, people are okay sometimes not over-engineering. It's like an indicator that they won't over-engineer everything, basically.
Yeah. And it's like so clear. It's like certain like cultures are like actually not that way. Like, certain startups have like cultures that very much like emphasize like solving hard technical problems and promoting the people that do that. And I think it's actually quite destructive to do that, and there's nothing wrong. Like, I love a hard technical problem, but like, I don't, it's a means to an end, right?
Exactly. Really great point. So, I mean, I can't have a conversation with Erik Bernhardsson without talking about the incredible blog post or short story, or what should we call it, that you released earlier this year.
Terrible.
And like, in that story, you are covering all of those journeys, the journey from discovering all of these different problems and sort of putting out the right fires where needed.
Yeah.
And you're also now, like, just now when we're talking about this, you're talking about who are the right people to do that. Like, if you would put out a recommendation for someone who is like about to take on a role like that, and vice versa for someone who's trying to hire for a role like that, like, what's your recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think, again, it's a sort of maybe the data journalist role we talked about. Like, I think, those are the people that I've seen to be most successful, are the people like, yeah, like, they're good with numbers. They're like okay with stats. Like, they're okay with like software engineering, but like beyond everything, they're like just driven by this like pursuit of the truth. Like, they're like, I'm going to win the Pulitzer Prize. I'm going to find some like, smoking gun in the data.
I'm going to get my stats into the board deck.
Right.
Now, I mean, like, the interesting thing also about this is you wrote this story, and it's like it triggers many people with their PTSD. And like, the interesting thing about it is like, what is so fun about it still? Like, why do we really love doing this? Like, this is for me, when I look back for example, on my quiz up time, probably every week I was like, why am I doing this? Like, why don't I just like go, build a house somewhere, or like be a farmer or whatever. But there's something that pulls us back into this like super, especially then when the data role of a company was just so much still being shaped. So what do you think, like,
I mean, I don't know. Like, I think there's a part of everyone in tech who's like, whole career purpose is that like they see like incompetence around them and they want to like kind of like fix that and like show how it could be done better. Right.
Yeah.
Like, even though like no one would admit it, like that's kind of like, I think a big part of like what drives people to like advance in their careers is like they get to a certain level and they're like, what's actually going on here? That's not very good. Like, I bet I can do better. And I think, like with data, it's been especially painful, I think, as a lot of people like go into that industry and like look at what's actually going on. Like there's so many like weird things that are sort of evidently not good. And so I think, I don't know, like maybe that's what pulls people back is like the sort of feeling that like they want to show how it could be done better. Right.
Yeah, I like that. So something about leaving a legacy.
Yeah.
But, if I talk about like, for myself, it was like, always ultimately, because you mentioned earlier that like, okay, you joined the first time around before you made a brief stop at a hedge fund.
Yeah.
You were there to build a recommendation engine, which is super exciting. And it's one of the things that, for example, when I joined QuizUp, I was like, yeah, I'm hired as a data analyst, but I'm going to be working on also super cool stuff that they don't even know about yet.
Yeah.
But obviously I had the same experience as you, which is there are more pressing issues to be solved here.
Right.
So I think like ultimately, potentially what was also driving me was like, I'm building a better world for myself where in the future I can work on even more cool stuff, or some of the people I am working with can work on all the cool stuff when we figured out the plumbing.
Yeah, totally.
So it's like a carrot.
Yeah.
Beautiful world carrot.
Yeah, you passed the marshmallow test. You're like, you held off, and then you get the marshmallows.
Exactly. Awesome. On this note of the data teams and like the where do they report to and what are their roles, and you touched on like the fact that you typically always framed the role as a data engineer. You also had a great recent article about what is the right level of specialization.
Yeah.
With some great analysis of some kitchen cooks and cutting onions and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and it's like, it's funny because like, I just said like, I think data engineer is like one way to frame what I want. But on the other hand, like, I also think data engineers should not exist. Like, I mean, in the sense that like, like if I look at like so much of the work, what like data engineers do across companies is like building platforms that they should not be in the business of doing. And I think what's sort of the sad truth about like data these days, it's like it's almost become like a superset of like software engineering. It's like, in order to be a full stack data person, I'm just going to call it data person for now, like you kind of need to know like, all the data science and all the software engineering and maybe a bunch of other stuff around, whatever. So that's a bad thing. And because it's full, like the stack is full, like, you can't fit more stuff in there. And so, and like, I think there's a lot of reasons why, like, actually, like, why do we like normalize things around like what software engineer is doing? Like, why do we like think of this as like an extension of software engineering? Like, there's a lot of things actually that maybe in the data world is very different that, we shouldn't be doing. And I think, one of the things that I think, I mean, this is broken even in the software engineering world, but like, sort of infrastructure tooling, the stack right now, I think is, has like very poor abstractions. Like there's just so much like garbage you need to learn about like Kubernetes and Docker and Terraform and all these other tools to like actually like build like infrastructure. And like, to me, the vision has always been like, how can we get people to spend 100% of the time thinking about business logic? Mm-hmm. And I mean, I don't know, like I'd imagine this may be like a poor sort of, terrible, like crude version of like, history. But like, I'd imagine like when electricity came, maybe it was like the same thing. Let's say you're like a garment factory and you're like, wow, there's like new electricity thing. Like, I bet it's like really cool. Like, we could use it, hook it up. Like, we don't have to have, windmills like powering our like whatever. I don't even know what the term is. But like, in order to build your own like electricity, like I bet you have to hire like a bunch of mechanics. You have to hire a bunch of like, people like understanding how generators work, and a bunch of people like build it. And, but over time, like those things are just like, become commoditized. So you're just like, buying a power line from the power company, you just plug it in, and all these engines are built in China, and you just like buy them on Alibaba and they get shipped to you. And like, and then, and those things like are now just like things we take for granted. But like, all these like weird sort of professions that had to deal with like every factory building their own like power supplies, went away. And I think, there's always this thing where like new technologies come, like, first everyone has to hire all these like specialists that do it themselves. But over time, those things tend to factor out into platforms and separate companies, just like a power company. And then you just buy it from there. And then people can go back to what they're good at, which is like, I don't know, managing factories or designing clothes or whatever it is. And then like do that, right? And I don't know if that was the best analogy, but like that's a little bit how I think about it in sort of historical context.
Yeah, I like that analogy. It's like I talk about it sometimes with just literally with Avo when I'm explaining it to like a person that's not very much in the data space or even just the software space. It's like we're building tools for developers so that, imagine if you're a chocolate maker and the first thing you would have to do is like build the whole machine to mix chocolate before you can even just start about thinking.
Totally.
But like you made a case for specialization and like having everyone on the team be able to do basically anything that needs to be done on the data team, sort of. Obviously, I think like I agree with you. There's like some level of specialization that you want to have on the team. You want to allow people to grow in the trajectory that they want to grow. But like, would you literally recommend against, for example, teams having special roles, data teams having special roles?
All of what I'm saying is like somewhat aspirational, right? Like what I'm saying is like, I would love a future where like there's less specialization. I think people should always strive for less specialization. When I started building up my tech team at Better, like I didn't hire front end and back end people. I only hired full stack people.
Exactly.
And then, over time, like we're like, oh yeah, but like, someone really needs to like think about CSS and whatever. And then we started hiring front end and back, separate. And I think that goes for everything, right? And I think where a lot of this drives, it's like, the sort of latency and the, of like human communication and the coordination costs of like, assigning different people tasks and sort of bouncing it back and forth. So it's sort of, the specialization argument also like applies within teams, but also like across teams. Like I think, everything else equals, it's much better to have full stack people that can do everything themselves. Yeah. But let's say you don't have that, and let's say you have a bunch of specialized, people like doing a lot of different things. Then still everything else equals. Like it's better to have them in the same team, because like because then at least like you have like roughly like the resources like management is still like easier. Like coordinating things between two teams, like the sort of latency it takes is like weeks. Coordinating things between people within the same team, the latency is like I don't know, a day at most, right? Coordinating things between the same person doing the same thing, like the latency is like, minutes or seconds or whatever. Like it's just, so I think, when you're building a startup or any company like that, for that matter, like these coordination costs, like they add up and they cause all these like conflicts and, and make it harder to get things done. And then you add all these like project managers on top of that. And then they end up like needing coordination. And so to me, it comes down to like the ability to like, get things done in an autonomous way that doesn't require all these like coordination costs. And then to some extent also flexibility, right? Like you don't know from day to day what you need. And so, having people who can do like a little bit of everything makes sense.
Exactly.
I guess the third thing would also be to some extent also like many companies, like you don't want people who are like driven by like a particular tool. You want people who are driven by outcome. And I think that goes a little bit hand in hand with like hiring generalists, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm not like an absolutist here. Like I'm making more like a completely relativistic argument here. Like everything else equals, like less specialization is good is kind of my argument.
Exactly. Yeah. I remember you explicitly added that disclaimer in the blog post after you got some backlash after the proclamation on Twitter, which is funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you because I recently also, and just like as a data point into this conversation, I recently had a conversation with a friend about recruiting on an engineering team. And like the premise of the conversation was also a little bit around like how companies can structure their recruiting and interview processes to find the right people for the team. Because we don't want to exclude people that don't yet have the experience that prove that they are right for the role. First of all, because it doesn't scale, there's just like there's such immense growth in like all of the different roles in software. So you really need to be hiring, young people coming out of college or whatever. And obviously they won't have the experience that you need for the team. Yeah. And then the other thing is like, it won't allow people to penetrate the specialization ever. So like, I totally agree with the mindset that it works better, particularly for early stage teams, if they try to hire a generalist. I mean, there might be a time in your like life as a development team or a software organization that you need a really specialized infrastructure engineer to solve a specific problem, and like,
for sure.
But that is far from the first people on your team, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes beyond like team building too. Like I think a lot about it, like now that I'm like thinking about the tools that I can build for other companies to buy, like my goal to a large extent is also like to build the tools that enable less specialization. Like, can I do the things that, currently force specialization, and so that, people don't have to think about it? Because like, all those reasons like why people specialize, like to me are like kind of bad and like, should be avoided. And like, if I can give the tools so people don't have to think about infrastructure, don't have to think about like all these things, like, I think they can go back and like focus on business logic 100% of their time, aspirationally. So I think that would be good. Like that's a sort of, somewhat naive vision that I have in my head is like, that's where we should try to get to always. Like if people are spending, disproportionate time not doing business logic and like other stuff, like that's a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly. It brings me to wanting to ask you about any hot takes about titles in the data space. We've already sort of aligned in this conversation that we're not going to call them data scientists here on. We're calling them data persons, at least in this conversation. But like, I mean, okay, you hired data engineers. I find it interesting to hear your take on like when people advertise the role data scientist. How helpful is that?
I mean, I actually don't really think it's that important. Like, I think, long term as like, roles sort of hopefully consolidate and despecialize. Like, if we end up with like fewer overall numbers of titles, like that would be a good thing. I don't care which one in the end, like, is that role. At Better, we ended up with both data scientists and data engineers, and that was fine, right? Like, and I think that's fine. I don't know, like, I really don't have a strong point of view of like which title is the best one in the long run.
The one thing that I think we might be approaching soon, but at least for a really long time, we were not there. When people were advertising for the role data scientist, I think a lot of the time you would get someone that really did want to just like do research and, work on their machine learning or something like that. And so I think that's one of the downsides of like, but we might actually be approaching a reality in the world where when you see the role data scientist in a software company, then you can sort of understand what that means.
Yeah.
5 years ago, I don't think that was the case.
I agree with that. 5 years ago, if you put up a role description for data scientist, you would get about like 1,000 applicants who all they wanted to do was to train machine learning models.
Exactly.
And so I agree with that. Like, and so that's again why I usually would call it data engineer. But like, I think you're right. Like, if you put up data scientist now, like, there's a better like expectation of like the fact that like, you might do some machine learning, but there's also many other things you will do.
Yeah. So expectations versus reality is closer today for the role data scientist than it was 5 years ago, maybe.
Yeah, I think and hope so.
I want to maybe talk a little bit about like, because we're on the right track and it is an all-encompassing data culture building, knowledge sharing podcast. So I want to go into practical things about, because you already mentioned one of the things that you sometimes wish you had done even better and that you're recommending that teams do earlier, literally talking about analytics logging and releasing analytics for feature release. I think that's like a thing that's like a bastard. It's a bastard baby where the where like the data person is responsible for making sure there is analytics in place for something, but they have absolutely no control over whether the analytics was actually in place when something was released. And then the software engineer, like this is, I'm talking very general and like, at an early maturity stage of a company, software engineers might not have interest in data, or they see it as like something that's not relevant for the end user or something like that. And then you reach a different maturity stage where like it becomes a little bit more intertwined. Can you talk about analytics for product releases and what that process looked like, for example, for Better, when you already had like the Spotify experience? Who was involved in planning analytics, implementing it, QAing it, analyzing it, prioritizing feature work based on data? And I'll set one more stage for the question. The reason why I think this is particularly interesting for product analytics is for many data sets, they don't change much over time, right? But product analytics data sets, they are ever changing because you're always changing our product. So can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I guess I don't have like too much to say other than that, like the sort of the observation that here's really where sort of embedding model makes the most sense. Like if you have a fully centralized data team, like you're always going to have this like misalignment where like, some software engineers are like, releasing whatever they want to. And then it's like this like centralized data team's job to like make sense out of it. And like, they might not have like anything to like, go by, right? Like, 'cause there's like a open loop. There's no closed loop. Like the software engineers have like, it's like a principal agent or whatever problem or something like that. I don't know. There's like misaligned incentives. So that's where I think, if you have an embedded model instead, I don't necessarily think you solve 100% of it, but I think at least like it becomes the product manager's job to make sure like whatever they're building is also like, it's the onus is on them to show the impact and the metrics. And so, so then they are going to go make the software engineers talk to the data person who's working with the product manager to make sure that, whatever they're building is something that they're going to be able to like show had like whatever measurable impact on metric later. So I think that sort of works and is probably as good as it gets. That's the thing I've seen in reality, like that can work.
Yeah, I could not agree more with that. It's about sort of bringing those stakeholders together. In practical terms, what did that process look like for Better or for Spotify?
I mean, I think it's more like, like just making if you align incentives, like things usually fall out. So like, let's say you have an embedded team, like where like data engineers are embedded and they work with like feature teams. Then let's say you have a data-driven culture where it's the job of product managers to show the impact they're making through data. That's kind of all you need, because like now the product managers, like they're going to be measured, but they know like people are going to ask about the data, so they're going to go talk to the data engineer, like, or the data analyst or whatever, or the data scientist, and the software engineer is going to go talk to them too. And so I think those are the tenets. Like that's it. Like I think that's enough. Like this should be the only two things you need.
You mean like set that stage and then people will figure out the process?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that like incentives matter, and if you solve the incentives, like you kind of automatically solve a lot of other downstream things, right?
That's a beautiful way of seeing it. I wish the entire world agreed with that, or saw it that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the same thing as like I always think about this as like people are like sort of the root cause of almost everything. Almost every dysfunction is like some sort of function of like misaligned incentives, or could be information asymmetry or whatever it is. And like if you go beyond like the sort of obvious things, like you often find some sort of like people problem like that behind the scenes, and that's actually the real thing you should fix.
Yes,
which is very hard. Yeah, and then an organization and accountability mechanisms and all kind of stuff.
Culture.
But yeah, culture is a big one.
Yeah. I guess like we've already touched a little bit on this, but can you list out some of the things that you wish existed, or that you wish you had, back and Better, for example?
Yeah, I think, it's still sort of crazy to me, like how much time we spend, like any engineer spends on like infrastructure. And I think we're still like so early in that journey of like getting away out of like the business of like thinking about resource management and provisioning and like, and configuration and all that stuff, like thinking about 100% business logic. And I know that's sort of abstract, but like, the amount of like time now, Kubernetes is probably a little bit better than what we had before, but like I look at it and it's like, it's still kind of complicated. Like people spend a lot of time like debugging weird things, and it's like, that's hard. I don't know, like I think on the data side, like we've come a long way. There's like Snowflake, there's dbt, there's like all these like ETL tools, and we're starting to have more like real-time stuff like Materialize, which is pretty cool. And but like I still feel like we're still early, and there's still so much of a time that's spent like kind of duct taping together a lot of different tools, like thinking about deployments, like thinking about productionizing things, like thinking about like, how do we get these things working together? Like every single like data team that I talk to at different companies are like sort of building the same internal platforms, for self-service, for metrics, for dashboarding. Like some of them are like starting to factor out into like startups and businesses offering these as a service. But to the extent that they're factored out, like they tend to be often like kind of like what I think of as like widget type companies that, over time, like, then the burden is like, okay, now we need to integrate these like 35 vendors, and that's a lot of work. And so I don't know, I sort of, wish for a world where there's like fewer set of like vendors that offer like more holistic things that sort of snap together in beautiful building blocks. And, people don't have to think about the things that they shouldn't think about, and they can focus on like, what is it that the business needs? And then just like use platforms for everything else.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess it's like we're in the fragmentation stage right now, but we might be approaching a stage where things start to get consolidated again.
I think so. And I think a fragmented thing to me is often a sign of massive demand, but poor supply in a way. Like it means like no one's like really cracked the nut. Like how do we actually build like something that scales well and has like good economics? But on the other hand, it means like there's a lot of demand. Like, there's a lot of people paying for a lot of these like small vendors. And, and then that to me, I think is like a very exciting market. To be in, as now that I'm thinking about being in that market as a tools provider, I think there's a huge opportunity. I think clearly with the amount of demand for these tools.
Exactly. Yeah. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is like, okay, can we just consolidate the role of a data scientist so that they don't have to be super specialized and like have to build all of the infrastructure as well?
That's right. Yeah.
And it sort of reminds me, I have to plug this in here. Our last guest was actually Josh Wills, who I know for a fact you once said was kind of interesting, which I find hilarious.
I was referring to one of his tweets. And then he like put it on his like Twitter profile as if I was making a statement about him. So that's the backstory.
That's a very good additional backstory. But he had this definition of a data scientist as a person who is better at statistics than any software engineer and better at software engineering than any statistician. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that seems right. Sort of Pareto frontier of, those two axes. Like you're slightly better in some way. You're on the efficient frontier.
Exactly. And you mentioned that your background is actually in physics. It's not in computer science and math. And that's the same background as I have. Like I have a mathematics and a philosophy background actually as well. So maybe that's like a good combination.
I do not have that. So I have nothing to say about philosophy.
Let's pivot the show.
Yeah.
But maybe sort of to start wrapping things up, I'd like to talk a little bit about like sort of people's misconception about data and what you wish more people knew about data and maybe data and product, specifically focusing on like data and product analytics. And then, some things that people can do right. So why don't we start with what are people's biggest misconceptions about how data and product analytics works?
One sort of misconception, we sort of touched on this, and I think this is pretty well understood at like startups, is to the extent that simple things are usually far more impactful than more complicated things. And I think the average startup understands this really well, but I don't think that's necessarily clear in the broader world. I think there's if you go talk to, the CIO or whatever, CTO, like a major like financial institution, I think there's often a desire to like feel like they've done everything they could, and like now it's time to get the AI to sprinkle the magic dust on top of it and get but the truth is like they probably haven't at all done everything they could. They have no idea where are people dropping off in their conversion funnel, and like where are like people struggling on their website, like people can't log in, like whatever, like and so to me, like one of the misconceptions I think in the broad world is like I think, when I think about like how my parents think about like us, data people, like I think they sort of think of us as like these people like devising, new mathematical, relationships to model super advanced, like whatever, using fluid mechanics to understand. But like in reality, I'm like, no, I'm doing a scatter plot of like, this dimension versus this dimension. And look at it, it's a little weird. So that's not good. Like, let's show this to someone. And that's like, can be has such incredible value. And I think, again, like I think this is very well understood at startups these days, but maybe less so among the sort of general population, like to what extent data work is like finding kind of crude things.
Exactly. Wow. I love that. First of all, just your framing of it. Simple things are usually more impactful than complicated things. And obviously it reminds me of the meme that's going on everywhere for all things right now, which is that like normal curve of intelligence. And like the stupid person does something, and then a medium range IQ does something super, super complicated. And then the very intelligent person does the same thing as the stupid person.
Yeah, I think that sort of data equivalent of that one would be the sort of the ends, the sides of the spectrum would say, look at a scatter plot, or I don't know, like
Exactly.
plot, like let's look at the chart, or like I don't know, and then the middle one would cry out and talk about like p-values and whatever, random forests. I don't know.
Exactly. I could not agree more with that. To wrap things up, some advice for the people who are listening. What is the first thing teams should do to get their analytics right?
I think they should think about the org structure first, and then think about like, the business goals first of all, and then kind of like solve backwards from that. Like, what is your purpose? What are you getting hired for? Like, how do you generate the most value? I sort of think aspirationally, like everyone should ask that every morning. Just come into work and say, how can I increase the value of this business as much as possible? And that's like a very hard question to ask yourself, and like not realistic at all. But I think, there's some sort of theoretical model for like, that I sort of like about that. Like, and everyone just like thinking about like, how can I act as a shareholder? How can I, do what's right for the business? And I think if you do that, like kind of solve for that backwards, like you can usually think through like, okay, what are the problems we should prioritize? Like, what are the stakeholders we should talk to? What are things that clearly are suboptimal right now that we should focus on? And then you can answer the question, okay, what data do we need for that? And like, how do we gather that? And then where do we put it? And how do we make it easy to like, query it? And like, and then you kind of, then you're done.
I could not agree more. And case in point, we literally developed a meeting at QuizUp called the Purpose Meeting. Which, like, okay, you're talking about the general purpose of the organization and your role, but ultimately we wanted to apply the same thing for every single feature release. And literally having a sit down like that, talking about the purpose of a release, merely for the goal of merging the stakeholders, like the product manager, the developer, the data scientist, and like into thinking what data do we actually need, but thinking about it like top down like that, it often actually sparked like a change in roadmap.
Yeah.
Just doing that train of thought in advance. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. It's super important.
Yeah, those are really good words to end this podcast episode with. Simple things are usually more important, impactful than complicated things.
Yeah.
And think about your purpose.
Yeah, I think that's what it's going to say on my grave one day.
I love it. Awesome. Well, Erik, I want to thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun.
It was very enjoyable. Look forward to part 2 when we know a little bit more about BurnCo.
Sure.
Very exciting. Very exciting. Yeah.
Sounds good. The dog walking, the Uber for dog walking.
Exactly. Thank you so much for joining us on The Right Track, Erik.
Thanks. It's fun to be here.
Thanks for listening to The Right Track. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Keep the conversation going with us in the Right Track community. Join us on therighttrack.avo.app. You can learn more about Avo at avo.app, and please follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter via AvoHQ.